23rd August 1942, Stalingrad, Soviet Union. The sky turned black at 4 in the afternoon, but it wasn't the approach of night, it was death descending from above. Over 600 Luftwaffe aircraft filled the heavens above Stalingrad like a biblical plague, their engines drowning out every other sound. Junkers U-87 Stukas screamed toward the earth, their sirens wailing like banshees as they released payloads that tore through apartment buildings, factories, and crowded streets. The explosions came in waves. First, the whistling descent, then the earth-shaking detonation, then the screams. Within hours, 40,000 civilians lay buried beneath the rubble. The Volga River itself caught fire as burning oil spread across its surface, transforming the waterway into a river of flame. In a basement shelter near the Barakati gun factory, a young Soviet mother clutched her daughter and whispered a prayer, her words lost in the thunder of bombs. Above them, the city that bore Stalin's name was being systematically erased from existence. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 5 months, 290,000 German soldiers would march into Stalingrad. Almost none would leave. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War, stories of courage, desperation, and the battles that changed history forever. Where are you watching from today? And could you imagine surviving what these soldiers, on both sides, endured in the frozen hell of Stalingrad? To understand how nearly 300,000 men could simply vanish from the face of the earth, we must first understand why they were sent to Stalingrad in the first place. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had begun on 22 June 1941 with overwhelming force. 3 million German troops, supported by over 3,000 tanks and 2,000 aircraft, had crashed across the Soviet border in the largest military operation in human history. The initial advances were staggering. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. By December 1941, German forces stood at the gates of Moscow, close enough for officers to see the Kremlin spires through their binoculars. But then, winter arrived. The Russian winter of 1941-42 was one of the coldest on record, with temperatures plunging to -40 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, equipped only with summer uniforms, froze in their positions, tank engines seized, machine guns jammed, and the Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, launched a massive counteroffensive that pushed the Wehrmacht back from Moscow's suburbs. The myth of German invincibility, so carefully cultivated through the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 to 1940, began to crack. Adolf Hitler, furious at the failure to capture Moscow, shifted his strategy for 1942. Instead of another assault on the Soviet capital, he would strike south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, the lifeblood of the Soviet war machine. Without oil, the Red Army's tanks would grind to a halt. Without oil, Soviet aircraft would sit idle on their runways. The capture of the Caucasus oil fields would cripple the Soviet Union and fuel Germany's war effort for years to come. But there was a problem: the Volga River. Running north to south through the heart of Russia, the Volga was the Soviet Union's primary transportation artery. Supplies, reinforcements, and oil flowed along this river. And sitting on its western bank, directly in the path of the German advance, was an industrial city of 400,000 people, a city named after Joseph Stalin himself. Stalingrad had to fall. Hitler became obsessed with it, not just for its strategic value, but for its symbolic power. Capturing the city that bore Stalin's name would humiliate the Soviet dictator and deliver a crushing psychological blow to Soviet morale. On 23 July 1942, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 45, ordering Army Group South to capture Stalingrad and block the land route between the Don and the Volga, as well as the Volga itself. The man chosen to execute this order was General Friedrich Paulus, a meticulous staff officer who had helped plan Operation Barbarossa but had never commanded troops in large-scale combat. Paulus was cautious, methodical, and fatally obedient. He would follow Hitler's orders to the letter, even when those orders led to catastrophe. By mid-August 1942, Paulus's Sixth Army had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. His force was formidable, over 270,000 men organized into 13 divisions, supported by 500 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and units from Germany's Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian allies. The soldiers of the Sixth Army were veterans of the Eastern Front. They had fought through the summer heat and survived the winter cold. They had conquered Ukraine, advanced deep into Russia, and truly believed that final victory was within reach. Stalingrad, they thought, would be just another city, just another victory. They could not have been more wrong. The Soviet defense of Stalingrad was entrusted to General Vasily Chuikov, a blunt-spoken, chain-smoking tactician who took command of the 62nd Army on 12 September 1942. Chuikov understood immediately that conventional defensive tactics would fail against the German war machine. The Wehrmacht excelled at open warfare, sweeping tank maneuvers, coordinated airstrikes, overwhelming artillery barrages. But Stalingrad was not open terrain. It was an urban labyrinth of factories, apartment blocks, and industrial complexes. Chuikov's strategy was simple but brutal. Turn every building into a fortress, every street into a killing ground, and stay so close to German lines that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb Soviet positions without hitting their own troops. "We will defend the city or die in it," Chuikov told his officers. "There is no land beyond the Volga for us." The German assault began on 13th September with a massive artillery barrage that shook the earth. Panzer IVs and infantry of the 71st and 295th Infantry Divisions pushed into the city center, fighting street by street toward the Volga. The Soviets resisted with fanatical determination. Every apartment building became a battleground. Germans would capture the ground floor while Soviets held the second. Fighting raged floor by floor, room by room, often at point-blank range. Grenades were thrown through doorways. Bayonets and shovels became weapons of last resort. One German soldier wrote in his diary, "We have fought for 15 days for a single house, with mortars, grenades, machine guns, and bayonets. Already by the third day, 54 German corpses are strewn in the cellars, on the landings, and the staircases. The front is a corridor between burnt-out rooms. It is the thin ceiling between two floors." This was Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, and it was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had ever experienced. By late September, the Germans had captured most of central Stalingrad, including the strategically vital Mamayev Kurgan, a 102-meter-high hill that dominated the city. From its summit, German artillery observers could direct fire on Soviet positions and the Volga crossing points. But the Soviets counterattacked with suicidal determination, retaking portions of the hill in vicious night assaults. Mamayev Kurgan changed hands multiple times, sometimes within a single day. The ground became so saturated with blood and explosives that grass wouldn't grow there for years after the war. Meanwhile, Soviet snipers turned the ruins into hunting grounds. Vasily Zaitsev, a former shepherd from the Ural Mountains, became the most famous of these deadly marksmen. Zaitsev was credited with killing 225 enemy soldiers during the battle, including 11 German snipers. His methods were patient and precise. He would lie motionless for hours, waiting for a target to expose himself for just a moment. One German soldier later recalled, "We were more afraid of their snipers than their artillery. The shells came and went, but the snipers were always watching, always waiting." German morale began to erode. The swift victories of the summer had given way to grinding daily combat that yielded nothing but corpses and rubble. Soldiers who had marched confidently into Stalingrad now moved through the ruins with hunched shoulders and darting eyes, flinching at every sound. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann, a young officer with the 267th Regiment, kept a detailed diary throughout the battle. In late September, he wrote,
Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day, it is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. When night arrives, one of those scorching, howling, bleeding nights, the dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to the other bank. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure. But how much longer could they endure? October brought a new phase to the battle, the fight for the factories. Stalingrad's northern district was dominated by three massive industrial complexes: the Dzernsky tractor factory, the Barakati gun factory, and the Red October steel plant. These weren't just symbolic targets, they were still producing tanks and weapons even as the battle raged around them. Workers would assemble T-34 tanks in the morning and drive them straight into combat in the afternoon.
General Paulus committed his remaining reserves to capturing these factories. The Luftwaffe pounded them with bombs and incendiaries, reducing entire buildings to skeletal frameworks of twisted steel. German infantry, supported by combat engineers with flamethrowers and explosive charges, assaulted the factories in a final push to reach the Volga. The fighting became even more savage. In the Barakati factory, Germans controlled the ground floor while Soviets held the floor above, with fighting seesawing between levels. Soldiers fought in darkness, in smoke, in rooms so filled with debris that movement was almost impossible. One Soviet defender, a young lieutenant named Anatoly Mereshko, later described the horror. There was no front line in the traditional sense. The enemy could be above you, below you, or behind the next wall. You never knew where death would come from. We lived in constant fear, constant exhaustion, and constant expectation of dying at any moment. By the end of October, the Germans had captured approximately 90% of Stalingrad. Chukov's 62nd Army was compressed into a narrow strip of land along the Volga, sometimes only a few hundred meters deep. German soldiers could see the river. They could see the eastern bank. Victory seemed within grasp, so close they could almost touch it. But then, the weather changed. November brought snow, ice, and temperatures that plunged below freezing. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms with only thin greatcoats for protection, began to suffer from frostbite and hypothermia. The Volga started to freeze, making resupply easier for the Soviets, but trapping German forces in the frozen ruins. Supply lines, already stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers, became increasingly vulnerable to Soviet partisan attacks. And behind the lines, hidden from German reconnaissance, the Red Army was preparing something monumental. Operation Uranus was the brainchild of General Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most trusted military strategist and the architect of Moscow's defense in 1941. Zhukov had been studying the German positions around Stalingrad for weeks and had identified a critical weakness. The German flanks were held not by Wehrmacht units, but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies equipped with obsolete weapons and lacking anti-tank defenses. Zhukov proposed a bold double envelopment. Soviet forces would punch through these weak flanks north and south of Stalingrad, then link up behind the German Sixth Army, encircling it completely. Stalin approved the plan. Throughout October and early November, the Red Army massed over 1 million troops, 13,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, and 1,400 aircraft in positions north and south of the city. German intelligence detected some of this movement, but drastically underestimated its scale. Paulus, focused on the street fighting in Stalingrad, dismissed warnings about a potential Soviet offensive. At 7:30 a.m. on 19th November 1942, the Earth exploded. Over 3,500 Soviet guns and Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire on the Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad. The bombardment was apocalyptic. Entire Romanian positions simply ceased to exist, obliterated by high explosive shells and rockets. Then came the tanks. Soviet T-34s and KV-1 heavy tanks, accompanied by waves of infantry, crashed through the shattered Romanian lines and raced westward across the open steppe. To the south, on 20th November, the same scenario repeated. The Romanian Fourth Army was overrun in hours. Soviet tank columns pushed north, moving at speeds that shocked German commanders. Romanian units, lacking anti-tank weapons and adequate artillery support, disintegrated. Some fought to the last man, others surrendered en masse or simply fled. On 23 November, the two Soviet pincers met at Kalach-on-the-Don, a town 50 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The link-up was complete. The German Sixth Army, along with elements of the 4th Panzer Army and 2 Romanian divisions, was now trapped inside a pocket approximately 40 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers deep. In total, 290,000 Axis soldiers found themselves encircled with no clear escape route. Friedrich Paulus was stunned. He immediately requested permission to break out westward while the Soviet ring was still weak. But Hitler, convinced that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air, issued a direct order. The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad and await relief from outside. It was a death sentence. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that his transport aircraft could deliver 500 tons of supplies daily to the encircled Sixth Army, the minimum needed to sustain the troops in combat. It was a catastrophically reckless promise. The Luftwaffe possessed barely 750 transport aircraft across all fronts, many already committed to other operations. The nearest functional German airfields were over 200 kilometers from Stalingrad. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses were formidable. Weather conditions in November and December were among the worst in decades, with blizzards and sub-zero temperatures. The airlift began on 25 November and immediately ran into disaster. On the first day, only 22 Junkers U-52 transports reached Stalingrad, delivering a meager 30 tons of supplies. The next day was worse. Soviet Yak-1 and La-5 fighters, guided by radar and ground controllers, intercepted German transport flights and shot them down in droves. One Soviet pilot, Ivan Kozhedub, later said, "They came in at low altitude, slow and heavy, easy targets. It was like shooting clay pigeons." Blizzards grounded entire squadrons. Aircraft that did take off often couldn't find the airfields inside the pocket, which were under constant Soviet artillery fire and barely maintained. Planes crashed on landing, others were destroyed on the ground. By early December, the Luftwaffe was averaging barely 100 tons of supplies per day, 1/5 of what was needed. Inside the pocket, the situation grew desperate with terrifying speed. Fuel ran out first, immobilizing tanks and vehicles. Artillery batteries fell silent as ammunition stocks dwindled. Medical supplies vanished, leaving doctors to perform amputations without anesthesia. And then came the hunger.
Rations were cut to 300 grams of bread per day, then 200, then 100. Soldiers began slaughtering the thousands of horses that had been used to pull artillery and supply wagons. Horse meat became the primary, often the only, source of protein. Men ate the flesh half frozen, sometimes raw because there was no fuel for fires. One German soldier wrote in his diary, "We killed a horse today. 20 of us fell on it like animals. I ate the liver raw. I didn't care. I couldn't stop shaking from hunger and cold." By mid-December, soldiers were boiling leather belts and boots to extract any trace of nutrition. They scraped wallpaper off ruined buildings to chew the paste, which contained traces of flour. Rats became a delicacy. There were whispered, horrifying rumors of cannibalism in the most isolated units, though these were never confirmed. And still, the cold deepened. December 1942 brought temperatures that dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, lacking proper winter uniforms, suffered agonizing frostbite. Fingers and toes turned black and had to be amputated. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, newspapers, and blankets torn from corpses. Some simply stopped moving, sitting in frozen positions until death claimed them. One doctor in a field hospital later recalled, "I performed over 60 amputations in a single day. We had no anesthesia. Men screamed until they passed out, and I knew most of them would die anyway from infection or starvation." Typhus and dysentery swept through the pocket. Lice infested every soldier. Dehydration became a critical problem. Men melted snow for water, but the effort of gathering and melting snow consumed more energy than the water provided. Soldiers grew skeletal, their eyes sunk deep into their skulls, their movements slow and mechanical. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate relief offensive aimed at breaking through the Soviet encirclement. Spearheaded by the 6th Panzer Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite formations, Manstein's forces punched through Soviet lines and advanced rapidly toward Stalingrad. By 19th December, they had reached Mishkova River, just 48 kilometers from the pocket's perimeter. For a brief, agonizing moment, salvation seemed possible. Paulus's staff prepared plans for a breakout operation, codenamed Thunderclap, that would punch through the Soviet lines to link up with Manstein's panzers. But Hitler refused to authorize it. He insisted that the 6th Army hold Stalingrad at all costs, and Paulus, ever the obedient officer, complied with Hitler's orders, even as his army starved and froze. Manstein's offensive stalled under fierce Soviet counterattacks. The 6th Panzer Division, exhausted and running low on fuel, could advance no further. On 23 December, Manstein ordered a withdrawal. The relief attempt had failed. The men of the 6th Army were alone. Christmas 1942 was the bleakest in memory. German soldiers huddled in frozen cellars and bombed-out buildings, singing carols in cracked voices while Soviet artillery thundered overhead. Some received letters from home that had been flown in weeks earlier, letters from wives and children who had no idea their loved ones were already dead or dying. Lieutenant Hoffman wrote in his diary on Christmas Eve, "The horses have long been eaten. Today it was a piece of bread the size of a matchbox. I think about my family constantly. Do they know we are lost?"
January 1943 was the final act. The Soviets launched Operation Ring, a systematic offensive designed to crush the German pocket from all sides. Over 7,000 artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers bombarded German positions day and night. The sound was deafening, relentless, maddening. Soviet infantry, supported by T-34 tanks, advanced methodically through the ruins, overrunning one German position after another. The Germans fought with desperate ferocity, but they were starving, freezing, and running out of ammunition. Units that had once numbered thousands were reduced to dozens. Officers stopped writing reports. There was nothing left to report. Entire regiments simply ceased to exist, their soldiers dead in the snow or captured by Soviet forces. On 8 January 1943, the Soviets broadcast a surrender offer into the pocket. Soviet General Rokossovsky promised humane treatment, medical care for the wounded, and eventual repatriation after the war. The message was transmitted in German on loudspeakers and dropped in leaflets from aircraft. Paulus forwarded the offer to Hitler's headquarters, requesting permission to surrender. Hitler's response was cold and unequivocal. "Surrender is forbidden. The 6th Army will hold its positions to the last man and the last round. It will make an unforgettable contribution to the German people by standing firm in its tragic and heroic situation." The bombardment resumed with renewed fury. Soviet artillery pounded what remained of German defensive lines. On 10 January, Red Army infantry stormed forward in human waves, often taking staggering casualties, but always pressing forward. The German perimeter shrank day by day, kilometer by kilometer. By 24 January, the pocket had been split in two. The southern group, concentrated around the city center and commanded by Paulus himself, was cut off from the northern group defending the factory district. Communication between the two pockets broke down entirely. Each fought in isolation, unaware of the other's fate, united only by shared suffering and impending doom. On 30 January 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal in a cynical gesture designed to pressure him into fighting to the death or committing suicide. No German field marshal had ever surrendered in battle. The message was clear. Paulus was expected to die rather than capitulate.
But Friedrich Paulus had seen enough death. He had watched his army disintegrate. He had witnessed soldiers reduced to eating scraps and dying in frozen agony. On 31st January 1943, Soviet troops stormed his command bunker in the basement of the Univermag department store. Paulus, hollow-eyed and defeated, surrendered the southern pocket. 2 days later, on 2nd January 1943, the northern pocket capitulated. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the 290,000 Axis soldiers encircled at Stalingrad in November 1942, approximately 91,000 were taken prisoner when the pocket finally collapsed. The rest, nearly 200,000 men, had died in the pocket from combat, starvation, disease, or cold. They simply vanished, their bodies buried in mass graves or left frozen in the ruins.
But even survival was not salvation. Of the 91,000 prisoners marched into Soviet captivity, only about 6,000 ever returned home. The rest died in Soviet POW camps from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Soviet camps were brutal. Prisoners were forced to march through blizzards, housed in unheated barracks, given minimal food, and put to hard labor despite their emaciated condition. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis ravaged the survivors. Death came slowly, cruelly. The last prisoners weren't released until 1955, 10 years after the war ended. When they finally returned to Germany, they were ghosts, broken men with haunted eyes and stories too terrible to tell. Many never spoke of Stalingrad again. The strategic consequences of Stalingrad were immediate and profound. The German Wehrmacht, which had seemed invincible in the summer of 1942, had lost an entire field army, including 24 generals, 2,500 officers, and over 90,000 enlisted men captured. The psychological impact was even greater. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. German civilians who had been told victory was inevitable began to doubt. Goebbels' propaganda machine struggled to explain the catastrophe. Morale on the home front cracked. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a sacred memory, a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and ultimate victory. The Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, had stopped the German advance. Stalin's prestige soared. Soviet soldiers, buoyed by their victory, began the long march westward, a march that would end in Berlin in May 1945. Historians often call Stalingrad the turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front, and they are not wrong. After February 1943, the Wehrmacht would never again launch a successful major offensive against the Soviet Union. From Stalingrad onward, Germany was on the defensive, retreating slowly but inexorably toward defeat. But beyond strategy and statistics lies the human cost, the individual stories of men who vanished into the frozen hell of Stalingrad and were never seen again. There was Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, a 24-year-old soldier from Bavaria who wrote letters to his wife describing the cold, the hunger, the fear. His last letter, dated 15th January 1943, read simply, "I don't think I will see you again. Please remember me as I was." He died 3 days later from starvation and exposure. There was Major Hans-Henrik Au, a career officer and veteran of the French campaign, who kept a detailed diary throughout the siege. His final entry, written on 28th January, said, "We are no longer human. We are animals fighting over scraps. If this is victory, then victory is worthless." His diary was found on his frozen corpse by Soviet soldiers who buried him in a mass grave with hundreds of others. There was Dr. Ottmar Kohler, a medical officer who performed countless amputations and surgeries without anesthesia or proper equipment. He wrote in his journal, "I have become a butcher, not a doctor. I cannot save them. I can only watch them die." Kohler was captured on 2nd February and died in a Soviet POW camp 4 months later from typhus. These men and 290,000 others like them marched into Stalingrad believing they were fighting for their country, for victory, for a cause greater than themselves. Instead, they found frozen ruins, starvation, and death.
They vanished not in glorious battle, but in slow, agonizing degradation, reduced to eating horses and rats, freezing in cellars, dying alone in the snow. The ruins of Stalingrad were rebuilt into the modern city of Volgograd, though the name was changed during the de-Stalinization era. Today, Mamayev Kurgan, the blood-soaked hill that changed hands dozens of times, is home to one of the world's most impressive war memorials. The Motherland Calls statue, standing 85 meters tall, dominates the skyline. Below it, eternal flames burn for the fallen. Visitors walk through halls inscribed with thousands upon thousands of names, Soviet defenders who gave their lives for the city. But there is no monument for the German dead. Their bodies lie in unmarked mass graves, scattered across the steppe. Their names are largely forgotten, remembered only by families who waited in vain for soldiers who never came home. They were victims of Hitler's hubris, Stalin's ruthlessness, and the brutal arithmetic of total war. Stalingrad teaches us that war is not glorious, it is not heroic, it is brutal, degrading, and profoundly wasteful. It consumes men and cities alike, grinding them into dust and memory. The 290,000 soldiers who vanished in Stalingrad did not die for a noble cause. They died because leaders made catastrophic decisions and refused to acknowledge reality until it was too late. And so the question remains, could you have survived that frozen hell? Could you have endured the hunger, the cold, the constant fear? Or would you have been among the thousands who simply lay down in the snow and never rose again? History does not answer these questions, it only preserves them, stark reminders of the cost of ambition, the price of war, and the fragility of human life when caught in the machinery of conflict. But while Stalingrad marked the turning point in the East, another desperate battle was unfolding in the Pacific, a struggle for a jungle island that would test the resolve of American Marines and Japanese defenders alike. Join us next time as we uncover the story of Guadalcanal, the 6-month campaign that turned the tide in the Pacific War. Subscribe now and never miss a story from the war that changed the world forever.